in Aotearoa, New Zealand, in alliance with our friends and family at Farmers Weekly. Now, we always love to focus on bringing you, hopefully, some diverse and balanced sides to the biggest issues facing our primary sector in New Zealand. And it's great to have the team at Farmlands on board. I was with them at Central District's Field Days last week in the tent where they were running a poll around what keeps you awake at night. And I thought I'd share the results with you. 32.7% of the respondents said government regulations, followed by 21.8% of unpredictable weather, with finances down at 17.3%. So, of course, we continue to unpack the raft of government regulations that are keeping our farmers and growers awake at night and try to bring some ease on the work that is going on behind the scenes to come to a bit of an outcome. Just before we get into today's show, I do want to highlight the incredible engagement we had on last night's Newsmaker show, particularly around the ACC subsidy on quad bike rollover protection. And we're joined by Motor Industry Association's Chair Simon Mead on that, as well as Pip Cameron's call for the government to put seatbelts on school buses in rural areas. Very much provoked a lot of our audience on their thoughts. So thank you so much for engaging on the live stream. We are undergoing, a bit of a review ourselves on Serious Country to ensure that, we are market-led just as much as we talk about our produce being here in New Zealand. So we'd really, really enjoy if you'd like to participate within a very, very short survey that we are doing. 5 quick multi-choice questions, only 2 minutes. All you need to do is text the word honest to 4040. The reason honest is because you can go in the draw to win an Honest Wolf Weekender bag, which is all beautifully made out of wool from Papanui Station in near Hunterville, thanks to our friends Sam and Sophie. So text honest to 4040 and you can get that link to the survey. We really appreciate it. We've had some incredible respondents so far and telling us how you like to listen to Serious Country and what you want to see more of. So we really appreciate if you wouldn't mind participating in that. Now, carrying on, as I said, 32.7% of the farmlands poll at Central Districts stated that government regulations is what's keeping farmers awake at night. And the main one that is on our high country leaseholders is the Crown Pastoral Land Reform Bill, which is threatening the viability of high country farming into the future. The bill proposes the Crown Pastoral Land Act of 1998 and the Land Act of 1948 ends tenure review and redesigns a regulatory system which is being described as duplication and potentially contradicts what's already going on in consenting requirements under district and regional planning of our freshwater and Indigenous biodiversity regulations as well. It's a pretty heavy one, Federated Farmers are saying, as they represent their view and weigh in on the debate. Currently, the submissions are before the Environment Select Committee, which is also being challenged that there is a conflict of interest. Green MP Eugenie Sage is chairing that. However, the Crown Pastoral Land Reform Bill was her legacy project last year among many, whilst she was the Minister for Conservation. So 2,000 submissions have been put before the Select Committee and are currently being reviewed. Also, Land Information Minister Damien O'Connor is passionate about ensuring, he tells us, that reviews will only be made if necessary, and that he has had close contact with the High Country Accord, the group that is chaired by Philip Todhunter to oversee the interests of 160 properties that are still under pastoral lease, 1.2 million hectares of land between Marlborough and Southland in the South Island. Some of our most spectacular properties utilised in our New Zealand tourism campaigns, and stewardship that goes intergenerational with some over 100 years. So within the opinion maker, we have had a few irons in the fire to reach out to multiple people to be involved with this show. Sadly, Kiri Allen, Minister for Conservation now, couldn't make the program. Neither could Damien O'Connor. However, we do have a very good lineup to fully explain what does this mean and how the work that is going on already in high country farm management plans for decades. I've asked Ian Mackenzie from Environment Canterbury to join our Opinion Maker show. He thoroughly explains around the differences between regional councils' expectations of properties and the duplication and additional overarching regulations. This will only be more red tape for high country farmers. We talk about how this all kicked off with Helen Clark's intervention under her tenure, and how there is a solution being offered where there hasn't been a problem to start with. Weighing in on it is ACT Party's rural spokesman Mark Cameron and his grave concerns for the government's way of handling this. And to end, we have a panel of two high country farming women, Kate Cox from Mount Nicholas Station, who's also a trustee on the High Country Accord, and Emily Murray from Glenmore Station in the Mackenzie Basin, both sharing their families' journeys, the huge work they're doing in pest management, both and weed control as well as rabbit control, and how they deeply are caring for the land already, and their concerns around the process that is going on at the moment. So a huge hour or so ahead of you within this particular Opinion Maker show this week. I thoroughly enjoyed catching up with my guests, and I really hope that you can sit back and get more informed on what is going on with the Crown Pastoral Land Reform Bill.
This is Sarah's Country, produced in alliance with Farmers Weekly, the place New Zealand farmers turn to for a trusted source of in-depth agricultural journalism. Stay connected to the matters that matter most by subscribing to My Daily Digest at farmersweekly.co.nz.
Oh, nice boots.
Yeah, thanks. They're new.
Ben, you alright?
Oh, yeah, sorry, mate. Just meerkatting pretty hard, eh? Yeah. I just said to myself, Ben, work hard. You deserve new boots.
Well, the Crown Pastoral Land Reform Bill proposes to amend the Crown Pastoral Land Act 1998 and the Land Act, which goes back to 1948, which will see the end of tenure review and redesign the partnership between Crown and high country leasehold farmers. Now, as the bill is now before the Select Committee, following submissions recently closing, concerns are being raised across the House with an opinion that ministers are completely dismissing farmers' concerns and using the environment as a pretext. And also that the Environment Select Committee is in huge conflict of interest with Greens MP but former Conservation Minister who drove the reform bill last year, Jenny Sage, chairing the group. Now, to discuss the political stance from the ACT Party is rural spokesperson Mark Cameron, who joins us now on the phone from the Beehive from Wellington. Mark, you've written a few opinion pieces coming out with a very strong stance on this. What is of your most grave concern?
Oh, look, hi, Sarah. I think more than anything, the simple fact is that these farmers have a huge sense of community. There has been some 2,000 submissions put in. They're all aggrieved. The fiscal well-being of the community is affected by this. When you actually look at it, the existing relationship between the Crown and the farmers was actually working, and it was based on trust and reciprocity. Now, that's changed. We've expedited a process which has essentially removed government from having to recognise Indigenous biodiversity in this space, and it's expedited the tenure review process. I mean, yeah, farmers are deeply aggrieved.
So when it comes to the, added red tape and higher costs around some of these environmental concerns, with the freshwater regulations and the Indigenous biodiversity regulations coming in, isn't there just a bit of a crossover that high country farmers will have to do a lot of these things anyway?
Yeah, well, the simple fact is they are. I think the thing is, Sarah, they are, and so the farmers that I've spoken to and the conversations that I had, overwhelmingly in the space of biodiversity and sustainable farming forward, they are actually making the necessary inroads. This is multi-generational. Farmers have actually invested in these properties for decades, and to remove that process, to remove that right, is potentially expeditiously actually going to cause greater damage than the damage being asserted out by Eugenie Sage and others.
And let's talk about Eugenie Sage. There's concern from National MP Jackie Dean of the huge conflict of interest of her involvement in the Environment Select Committee. Are you making any inroads on that being a fair and equal process?
I actually don't sit in the Environmental Select Committee. I'm obviously sitting in the one with the primary Select Committee. That I say that the assertions had been made that she was looking through a myopic lens. I believe it, and I'm quite happy to be corrected on that. Is no longer the case. Obviously, Minister O'Connor is involved with Land Information New Zealand. That process forward, I think, just if I can go off on a tangent quickly, there's 60% of the Mackenzie country that's held up in dock land. So why are we having these conversations when so much has been done to mitigate the environmental concerns, notwithstanding this gives the government and the Commissioner of Land Access the control of how they use the land? I mean, this is daft.
Yes, and I do need to note that we have reached out to both Conservation Minister Kiri Allen and, of course, Land Information Minister Damien O'Connor to appear on this particular program, which of both they couldn't. So to acknowledge that they would have had the right of reply on their perspective, but were too busy to join us. And thank you, Mark, very much for coming on board. The Commissioner of Crown Lands, there's been a call for him to lose his job. What were your thoughts on that?
Oh, look, I'll be quite candid. I can't speak to that. I don't know enough of the intricacies as I acclimate to all of this. But what I would say, on its face, I think there are many farmers that are aggrieved. I don't like, as I sit here in the vein of the political landscape, looking at it not myopically across the board, that the Commissioner of Land has that type of control over land use. That notwithstanding, most of the concerns in the environmental space of biodiversity actually being acknowledged by the farmers that have been investing in these properties in many instances for 30, 40, 50 years and more.
And the bio being, the use of sheep grazing within the high country to be able to offset things such as fire risk, as well as, the unique landscape values and that are already respected by high country farmers. I completely understand where you're coming from here. But, 1948, that is a very outdated act, Mark. If it was to be reformed, what do you believe is the right way?
That I say that I think you have to have a real holistic debate about what has actually been done. You referenced high risk. Now, the farmers that I've spoken to said under the Crown, it would actually the high risk would be worse. I mean, you've got, let's just look at it. The sum of all parts. Farmers inherently are the best stewards of their land. They are working to control things like tar and rabbits and Welding Pines. They also put up the necessary the fencing, stock exclusion fencing, to keep their animals out of Crown land. So really, I'd actually tilt the conversation the other way and say, you reference fire risk. The fire risk will be exacerbated under Crown ownership with the rights of the farming methodology being removed. I think when you talk about the tenure review process, the original act was 3 years. Now, that's significantly more at 10. But farmers invest a lot of money into these these properties have, fertiliser and pastoral species, a myriad of things. So really to remove that seems a counter-narrative when they are environmentally the best stewards of the land.
What is the process moving forward from here, Mark?
Open and honest dialogue, I think, Sarah, about what actually has been done, what is the of recognised Indigenous biodiversity. Farmers will embrace that language. They already have. They've already worked through an existing tenure review process that isn't counterproductive. And in many senses, some farmers would wager that it's potentially unlawful and unnecessary. So I think open, honest dialogue of what is being done, and having the right to, refuse the process, but fair and honest dialogue forward, I think, was the way to proceed with it.
So what makes it different from the regulations that are coming down the barrel at each and every farmer in New Zealand, regardless of whether they farm in the high country or not?
Oh, look, how long have you got? I could speak for hours about the aggrieved farmers that I'm speaking to.
Can you give us an example?
Oh, look, whether it's zero, fair and honest recognition, beg pardon, of on-farm sequestration in the space of the fresh water down in the deep south, saying, hey, look, we've got environmental plans in place. They've been working with council and stakeholders and industry for, in many instances, several years. David Parker's assertions that they're not tenable and they've got to be thrown out is to us like throwing, especially at the ACT Party, and generally as farmers, I am one, is throwing the baby out with the bathwater. So at every turn, the average New Zealand farmer sees a red tape, arbitrary compliance, all too often is not tenable. And in the case of, going back to the Crown Pastoral farmers that have these leases, it's a real contraction in cultural change for what we do as farmers in New Zealand.
But with regards to the high country specifically, Mark, freshwater regulations and Indigenous biodiversity coming into play, every farmer is on an equal playing field, regardless of whether they're leasehold or freehold, are they not, in their responsibilities for improved environmental outcomes?
Yeah, absolutely, and so they should be. And I think overwhelmingly these farmers are anyway. When look, we talk about stock exclusive fencing from animals, protecting obviously the important quality of fresh water. This is being done where it's practical, where practical application allows it to be so. I spoke to people, not in this instance, but they were in Te Kuiti. Same thing again. What we would call medium to high country farmers, sheep farmers, wool growers. And they're saying they've done all this stuff. When it comes to the necessary batten fencing and stock exclusion, a lot of this has been done. The water quality's improved. The local authorities are aware that the quality of the water has improved over the years. They've recognised it, and this legislation it flies in the face of that recognition, and that's travesty.
Thank you so much for your time, Mark Cameron, rural spokesperson for the ACT Party, continuously talking throughout today's show, the opinion maker around the Crown Pastoral Land Reform Bill, which is currently before this Environment Select Committee. And in words from Philip Todd Hunter, who sadly couldn't be on the program, he said many high country farmers already have integrated farm management plans in place. The tall regional councils and agricultural industry organisations are encouraging other farmers to develop. Given the small number of properties involved, it should not be too difficult for the Crown as leaseor through the Commissioners of Crown Lands and Leasees to agree contractually binding farm plans as a basis for an ongoing relationship between individual leaseholders and LINs. And these plans, high country farm plans, can take into account the particular inherent values of each and every property individually. So, yeah, that is the continuously conversation that is happening around this from every angle. And so after this very short break, we're going to be back with Environment Canterbury's councillor Ian Mackenzie, who will give us his side of the story from a regional council's perspective and what he is seeing within the Canterbury High Country up next here on Sarah's Country.
This is Sarah's Country, produced in alliance with Farmers Weekly, the place New Zealand farmers turn to for a trusted source of in-depth agricultural journalism. Stay connected to the matters that matter most by subscribing to My Daily Digest at farmersweekly.co.nz.
One of the first things you learn when you live out here
is where to shop for the things you need to live out here.
like electric fencing,
or horse feed,
or bee suits.
children,
chook food.
Do you want a couple of these?
Or something stylish to wear. Not everyone's got stuff like this.
But at Farmlands we do, and then some.
So if you need anything to help you farm,
Grow, milk, drench,
rear, come on in.
because we're out here too.
Well, National MP and spokesperson for conservation Jackie Dean spoke to Farmers Weekly journalist Annette Scott in last week's Farmers Weekly about her view that the Crown Pastoral Land Reform Bill clearly aims to put an end to farming in the high country. And one of the 2,000 submissions before the Environment Select Committee will be from the regional council that has a large majority of leasehold high country properties within its boundaries, Environment Canterbury, who have been one of the most proactive councils with the introduction of farm environment plans well before national regulation. So how do you balance the shared environmental outcomes of our catchments from the mountains to the sea under different land management? To explain more to us is Environment Councillor and farmer Ian Mackenzie, who's also had various roles with federated farmers at regional and national levels and joins us now. Ian, could you please paint the picture for us who don't understand and have a background around the Crown Pastoral Land Reform, the Tenure review, and how it differs of Environment Canterbury's role and Land Information's role?
I'm not sure I'll be very good at doing that, Sarah, but because it seems to be a double up. What this Act is proposing is a double up between LIN's responsibility and the Regional Council's responsibility. We have responsibility to all land management to ensure that water quality and land degradation doesn't occur. And so we have overarching jurisdiction, I guess you could say, in terms of what should or shouldn't be done on the land, and that tends to be incorporated into our sub-regional and regional plans. Of course, that role has been usurped by central government in terms of the Essential Freshwater Package, which then sets another layer on top of all the plans we already have in place. And as far as I can see, this Act is putting another layer on top for regulatory control by LINs as opposed to the Regional Council, to which high country leaseholders will have to comply. And I can understand a degree of nervousness from leaseholders what this might look like in the future. But it's probably a bit too early to say just how LINs and the Regional Council will settle into working either with each other or just creating multiple layers that will be imposed upon the leaseholders.
The reason I ask that is, the reason I ask that is I'm trying to get my head around Philip Todd Hunter, the chair of the High Country Accord, who couldn't be with us sadly on this program, but has written a large piece, is around some of the things with the requiring a consent to carry out fencing work, to fencing off waterways, and then of course replacing that with a stock water system, and a long list of conditions to meet. It seems what I'm trying to clear up is that the farming activity change and land use change, is this more than what will be required of each and every farmer across New Zealand? And if so, how?
I think in the face of it, it probably is no more than every other farmer has to face, and that you'll know that all farmers are effectively being told what is acceptable, what isn't acceptable, this concept of license to operate. I think what is different is, well, what is unclear is at this stage is just who will have that jurisdiction, how many layers of jurisdiction Philip and his fellow high country leaseholders will have to face to get those consents. Because if you have to have them if LINs have any variation in their requirements for consent in the regional council and the essential freshwater operating the essential freshwater package, then there might be multiple layers of consenting required. If LINs, the regional council, and central government work and have one a combined set of rules which applies, which is the same as pretty much makes the rules the same as everybody else, then the high country guys will be no better or worse off than those of us who farm in other parts of New Zealand.
Ian, I understand yourself and other councillors have been on multiple high country properties, in not only in your role but also with Federated Farmers, and you've seen firsthand the conservation work that leaseholders do within the high country, but you may also have other concerns around what they could be doing better. From your personal opinion, what are you seeing out there, and what direction would you like to see around the high country's future?
Well, my personal opinion is that ever since Helen Clark got intervened in tenure review and made it compulsory, the high country run holders have been on a short path to problems, and that's because they had a system which, as you say, which resulted in very high level of stewardship through the tenure, through the lease process. Intergenerational, effectively as close to freehold as you get without actually being freehold. There were limits on what they could do, but that was agreed between LINs and the leaseholders. And the net result was actually a very high level of stewardship by high country run holders to the land that they had control over. Helen Clark intervened politically, and I think it's created an expectation from the public that they have a say in everything that goes on land, which is not always positive, and B, it created quite a lot of unintended consequences. And so some of those unintended consequences are that those run holders who quite legitimately went through tenure review got criticised for taking advantage of perhaps some so-called preferential treatment, and they did it for all the right reasons, and they were in fact had to do it because it was a compulsory process, as I understand it, pretty much a compulsory process. But what has happened is that there has been some considerable intensification in some areas in the high country, on that leasehold country where that's become freehold. To balance the fact that a lot of those guys had to give up their summer or extensive grazing opportunity to take the ecological pressure off their stations. Where that's happened, of course, the regional council gets involved, because if you've got small, shallow, and now slightly warmer lakes because of climate change, and suddenly a degree of intensification in the catchments that feed those towns and lakes, then you're likely to have ecological issues, which is where the regional council comes in, because we get it in the neck every time something goes wrong anywhere in New Zealand to do with water quality. So there's no question there have been some unintended consequences. Some leaseholders have done very well out of tenure review. I suspect most of the ones that haven't gone through tenure review now were reluctant to do so because they couldn't see the benefit to them in going through tenure review. So the stopping of the tenure review is perhaps not such a big issue. It's this question now of the bureaucracy that's going to be put on top of those run holders, and they'll need some clarity as to who will have jurisdiction, whether it's LINs or the regional council, and they'll want that sorted out. And certainly the consenting process looks pretty onerous to me from a farmer's perspective. But they are farming in fairly sensitive catchments, a lot of these guys, and it's perhaps become really evident since COVID hit that an awful lot of New Zealanders have got nothing else to do other than drive around visiting more remote spots, which is pretty cool. But of course that has an impact. It not only has an impact on the ability of leaseholders to acquire enjoyment of their lease arrangements, which is one of their prerequisites, but it also it also puts other ecological pressures on the high country for which farmers can get blamed. And so I look at what's happened on Lake Clearwater and the Ashburton Lakes. You have thousands of people, the public up there enjoying the water skiing and bicycling and tramping and stuff on a weekend up by Lake Clearwater. And yet when something goes wrong with the lake, it's automatically the run holder who's blamed for that. And I think those issues will become more prevalent because the public are constantly being told that they are incredibly benign to the environment, whereas farmers are really, really bad. And that's clearly not always the case. And many times it's not the case, but it's this conflict that we have, which the politicians, I think, quite often abuse. And I look at this act and wonder why, in fact, if Helen Clark hadn't intervened, however many years ago it was in the first place, whether you'd need to do this, whether, in fact, the state of the stewardship of the high country was benign enough that actually you didn't need government intervention.
But it's certainly...
It's a long-winded way of not answering your questions.
No, you certainly have covered off absolutely everything I wanted you to there. Thank you very much, Ian. And it's like we've had a couple of Prime Ministers who want legacy projects, John Key with his cycleways and Helen Clark with her conservation estates for people to go tramping, and that was at all costs to get to that point, and we've seen the flow-on effects of that. What we are also seeing the flow-on effects of as well is pest management. And in all of my 35 years, and I'm sure there's people watching, the rabbit control is absolutely at its worst it's been in generations, just particularly in the Cromwell Basin, let alone other pests across, and the personal money these leaseholders put into annual pest control is never acknowledged at such a large scale, but it has a flow-on effect down into neighbouring properties that aren't under lease as well.
Yeah, look, I think you've touched on a really strong point there, Sarah, and that is that we keep getting told around our council table that we're in a biodiversity crisis. Well, depending on where you live, it's not entirely obvious, but, I'm still young enough to be educated by people who think they know better than me. But the reality is that if we do have a biodiversity crisis in New Zealand, it's not because we've lost habitat, but it's because of invasive weeds and invasive pests and predators. And if you take away the jurisdiction from families who have intergenerational interest in their properties and give it to a Crown entity, history across New Zealand shows that is not a great way of looking after the interests of the land. And, some of these issues they've had with fires and rabbits, as you say, but certainly invasive weeds, willows, gorse, broom, briar. New Zealand isn't the country it was 200 years ago when Pākehā first came here to settle. We brought a whole lot of problems with us in terms of these pests and weeds. And so shutting up stuff for a conservation estate doesn't necessarily restore the ecological values that the desktop warriors who see themselves as the leading environmentalists in New Zealand actually want to achieve. And a prime case is the spread of Welding Pines. You shut up the high country, take away anybody's interests and specific landowners' interests in managing that, and weeds will just proliferate. And so I think there's a lot of naivety driven by sort of political rhetoric in terms of the way we address environmental issues in New Zealand. And I think the high country is probably a bit of a test case. A very small number of land people with an interest in the land, leaseholders or landowners, and a large number of public who all have opinions.
Yeah. I'd like to lastly ask you for our ignorance on the process, Ian. How close do central government work with regional councils to work on integrated solutions at a regional level?
The simple answer is I've only been a regional council for 18 months. I'm not sure how obvious it is.
There's been a lot happen in the last 18 months.
Yeah. Certainly we were, as a regional council, we were ignored by the government in terms of the essential freshwater package. I think a lot of it depends on the people involved and whether they've got personal connections to people in the right places. I'm not convinced that central government necessarily respects regional councils that much. It's not obvious in the way they operate. Having said that, we lost one of our top directors from the regional council, who is now sitting very close to God in at the Ministry for the Environment. And I think having those connections, she's a very smart woman, will make might make huge differences as long as ministers don't get too involved in directing what can and can't happen. You know, a lot of this it depends on, a lot of this legislation, as we talked about Helen Clark and the unintended consequences of her interference in the High Country. A lot of it depends on whether the ministers who are driving these changes are doing it from a personal, because they get an itch, they're going to scratch, or whether it's actually genuinely a problem that needs to be solved. And I know that one of the submissions suggests that this whole act reform is solving a problem that hasn't arisen yet. And I sometimes wonder about quite a lot of stuff that comes out of central government, where it's the minister who thinks they want to, as you say, they want to have a legacy project. I'm not sure that's necessarily the case, but I think that was the case for Eugenie Sage, who started this process. So she's not driving it anymore, clearly, but she's involved. If it's their legacy project, then the chances are the officials are trying to put in place something which isn't their own creation. So it's not driven by science, fact, or a logical conclusion. And that's really dangerous.
What a place to leave it there. Thank you so much, Ian Mackenzie, Environment Canterbury councillor, as well as local farmer who's been in local body politics across the board for quite some time, giving us some fantastic insight there from his perspective. To close the show, we have on the panel two fantastic high country women from two different areas, Kate Cox from Mount Nicholas Station in Queenstown and Emily Murray from Glenmore Station in the Mackenzie Basin, sharing their personal experience living and breathing this every day and how they want to see this go forward into the future, where we can nurture our communities as well as the environment and cohabit together. All that up next to close here on Serious Country.
This is Sarah's Country. Join the conversation. Have thoughts on an interview? Or have you got questions you want answered by a future guest? Let us know. Email sarah@sarahscountry.com.
Well, the Crown Pastoral Land Reform Bill takes into account 160 properties covering 1.2 million hectares between Marlborough and Southland. In the House, the debate is going on between both sides, where we heard earlier from ACT Rural spokesperson Mark Cameron, who believes that the Commissioner of Land has excessive control over how leaseholders can use their land for lawful purposes, whereas Land Information Minister Damien O'Connor states that he has been working in close contact with the High Country Accord and will only make changes where necessary. Well, joining our panel on the Opinion Maker this week is two women who are farming the High Country that make up two properties within that 160 properties affected under the changes to the Crown Land Act of 1948. Welcome to the program, Emily Murray from Glenmore Station in the Mackenzie Basin and Kate Cox from Mount Nicholas Station near Queenstown in the Wakatipu Basin. Thank you so much, ladies, ladies, for joining us. I think the best thing to do is we start by setting the scene about your own operation, just so we understand the scale between freehold, leasehold, and your involvement within the community over generations. Kate, I'll start with you.
Oh, hi, Sarah. Thanks so much for having me on this morning. So my family farms at Mount Nicholas Station, which is on the western shores of Lake Wakatipu. The station is just over 36,000 hectares in size, and basically all of it is pastoral lease. I think there's about 80 hectares of freehold, but it's for all intents and purposes completely pastoral lease. My family's farmed here for the last 45 years, and we farm merino sheep and Hereford cattle. I'm also a trustee for the High Country Accord Trust, which was established in 2003 to promote and protect the rights of holders of pastoral leases.
And Emily, to you.
Well, thank you, Sarah, also for having me on this morning. We farm Glenmore Station. We're on the western shores of Lake Tekapo. So we run from the shores of the lake right up to the Mount Cook National Park. We've got just over 19,000 hectares. And the Murray family, my husband Will, he is fourth generation on the property. So the Murray family have farmed Glenmore for over 100 years. And we run merino sheep, including a stud, and also Angus cattle and deer.
Kate, can you set the scene for us around your experiences right back to the initial days of Helen Clark's involvement in the High Country and this particular act that was established back in 1948 and the tenure review process through your eyes, but also to your involvement with the High Country Accord?
Yeah, sure, Sarah, and I'll try and sort of keep it brief, and then you can ask me more questions if you want to, because there's a lot to cover in there. But basically, if I go back to the Land Act when it was first established, the simple purpose to establish it was actually the lands were seen as being very marginal and difficult lands, and to a large extent they still are pretty difficult to manage. And so the Land Act was put in place to give leaseholders longevity, to encourage good practices and let them make longer term decisions. Prior to the Land Act, there wasn't a long term form of tenure in place. So the Land Act was put in place with that in mind, that it would give long-term security to leaseholders so they could do a really good job of looking after the high country and tackle longer-term problems, particularly around weed and pest, which to a huge extent in the high country has happened, particularly around control of rabbits, was a major issue back in those days. That needed tackled. So I guess that's the basis of why the Land Act was formed. Then would you like me to carry on a little bit from there?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, sure. So then basically it worked really well, but I think when the CPLA came in, it was really around some of the properties that initially had been, created as pastoral leases. A lot of them, it was deemed that it would be suitable or desirable to have portions of those properties return to full Crown ownership, so cease being alienated Crown land and become conservation land, and other portions of those properties were suitable to be freeholded. And so hence we got into the tenure review. And I think, at the time, the government's view was that perhaps all of those properties that were Crown pastoral leases would travel through and go through that tenure review process. Hindsight's always a great thing, and there was certain properties of which we've still got 160 of them. Some of those are in the process of tenure review, but the majority are not. That for one reason or another chose to stay as pastoral leases and not entered the process and exited the process again, or just weren't suitable to go through a tenure review. So we've sort of come to the point now where the Crown's accepted that maybe some of these properties won't go through tenure review ever, or that's their position. They would like to cease tenure review, and really it's about moving forward from here.
And Emily, what has been your family's experience with the tenure review process?
Well, Sarah, we entered into tenure review. It's a voluntary process. We entered in just under 20 years ago with the full intention to try and make a tenure review work for Glenmore, acknowledging that we do have a great deal of significant inherent values on the property, and we wanted to ensure that they are looked after for the future, generations to come. And unfortunately, we've just found the system to be incredibly frustrating. We certainly haven't made the inroads that we were hoping to make. We've been highly motivated through the whole process, but we were identified in February of 2019 as a priority property. The Minister of the day identified Glenmore. This is when the reform bill was in its early establishment phases. And so we were contacted by LINZ on behalf of the Crown to really try and push our tenure review through as quickly as possible. And nothing has happened since. So we are still at even after 20 years of negotiations, we're still at a very early stage of the process.
Wow, 20 years.
Yes.
Kate, what is the general feeling amongst those that you represent with the Accord of what an ideal future could look like moving forward, and making up some of the content of some of these submissions?
I think, Sarah, I think that the Accord, and I think most high country farmers have been quite dismayed by the legislation that we've ended up in front of us now. I mean, the relationship that we've had in the past with LINZ, although LINZ has been limited at times because of some of their resourcing and perhaps some of their capability, it's always been a contractual relationship, built on communication and trying to achieve common goals. And really what this legislation is doing, it's picking that up and trying to put a strong regulatory framework around the pastoral lease system, and at the same time removing the option for tenure review. And if I can just touch on the tenure review, and you've just heard from Emily about their family's experience with that. And for a lot of families, for families and, for the professionals that work with them and for LINZ too, a huge amount of time and money has actually been invested in a lot of these properties to get them to the point where they are now in their tenure review. And so it's a real waste of resource and time to actually completely cease that, other than a handful of properties that are almost across the line. And I think whilst tenure review has had some obvious deficiencies in the past, it remains a really good tool for being able to actually, move forward and establish conservation areas for the public, and move parts of properties which are perhaps more suited to freehold ownership into that type of ownership. And so it's a shame to give up on it completely without perhaps just reviewing it and trying to address some of the shortcomings that have been identified in the past.
Emily, how does a leasehold contractual agreement with the Crown look like in your eyes going forward if tenure review was to cease?
Oh, Sarah, we have grave concerns, particularly this reform bill is adopted, and we have new legislation around our contractual obligations with the Crown, because the pastoral lease, as it has stood historically, has given us a real feeling of belonging to the land. And as Kate outlined before, it's a huge motivator to look after the land and make really long-term decisions about what's best for the land. And I would say moving forward, at the moment, we're staring down a very strict regime of a high-cost regulatory system. And to be honest, we would rather spend our hard-earned money on caring for this land than getting caught up with consultants and just more and more regulation and processes when we've already got district regulation to deal with, regional and national, and to add another layer on top of the RMA review that's happening at the moment. I have grave concerns about what the future will look like for us as a pastoral lease.
So when it comes to, for both of you, freshwater regulations, Indigenous biodiversity regulations nationally, how can the High Country actually integrate farm management plans with what is already happening at regional council level and achieve the same outcomes that pastoral lease the LINZ is actually wanting to achieve collectively of what's already going on? It seems like a double up.
Can I have a go at that one first, Emily?
Yes, go for it, Kate.
I think Sarah, with the integrated farm management plans, if I take a step back and look at the new regulations the proposed regulations as they stand, one of the really big problems that's out there is that it treats all properties as if they are the same and really turns it into a box-ticking type exercise. And high country properties are not the same. They vary hugely between the regions. When you look at topography, altitude, rainfall, the underlying soil quality, aspect, like you name it, there's going to be variation. They are very, very different properties. So trying to adopt a one-size-fits-all just can't serve the purpose, and that's where integrated farm management plans can actually work really, really well, because they enable you to look at each property individually, identify its strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, its really delicate areas that are in most need of protection, and that'll be quite different for different properties. And so we actually would have put our time into that, and a lot of farmers already have those in place. They're going to also be a requirement for fresh water, and for a lot of our quality assurance programs, we're required to have them. They will be really useful for Indigenous biodiversity. I think they're a fantastic tool that we could actually use, as the basis for a lot of collaborative work with all of the various entities, rather than us having to redo applications, redo explanations every time we want to speak to a different authority, or every time a piece of legislation is reinvented. This is something that could actually sit over the top of a lot of that and answer a lot of questions and give outside stakeholders quite an intimate perspective of property in quite a short time.
Emily, and what are you hearing there from Kate that's in similar situations at Glenmore?
Well, I think I completely agree with Kate, and I also think that if, in the establishment and creation of this reform bill, no one drove up our drive and came and talked to us about what is best for Glenmore, how best they could support us, because I think part of this, Sarah, is that there needs to be a greater acknowledgement of the years and, over a century that the Murray family have been, a good example is Glenmore here. Just the intricate, intimate knowledge that we have of our land, and acknowledging that high country farmers care deeply for the environment, care deeply for the land, and we're very passionate about its future. And so, as Kate acknowledges, the one size fits all is just cannot be a way forward. And we've had a farm management plan here on Glenmore for the last 15 years, and we've been working closely with Professor David Norton from Canterbury University to establish that plan, and it's reviewed regularly. And we also have photo monitoring points over the whole property. We have exposure plots over the whole property, and we always get an independent people in to take the photos and to do the studies on where we're heading with that. And that's just to absolutely make sure that our farm management practices are not really working well with the native cover on the property. And we're seeing some fantastic results from that. So the farm management plan really is, as we see it, the only way forward.
Kate, we spoke to Ian Mackenzie just earlier from Environment Canterbury, particularly about the huge work that high country properties do in pest eradication, both plant and animal, that were introduced species, of course. Could you give us an idea around the land at Mount Nicholas and how much has been involved in that 40 plus years that your family have been there?
Yeah, sure, Sarah. Look, I wouldn't even actually like to. I think it would sort of scare me if I added it up completely when you look at particularly if you take the time into account as well. But you're right in saying a lot of the pests that we've got here have been, with the best intentions, introduced for various reasons over the years, and have proliferated in a New Zealand setting and have done things that they don't do in their home countries and cause the high country a lot of problems. Our main issues here, gorse, broom, willow trees. Willow trees were planted, to secure riverbanks, but unfortunately they really enjoy proliferating into the high country, and if they get into indigenous high altitude wetlands, they can dry them up in a matter of years and destroy the wetland. And so there's issues like that you need to deal with in a short space of time and manage very actively. Welding pines are a small issue for us. There was some welding pines planted by the catchment board for erosion control, and they've proliferated. We've had really great support from the local Welding Pine Control Trust in helping us get those under control, but the seedlings keep coming up. Rabbits, there's been, just prior to us coming to the station, over 1 million rabbits were poisoned. That was an estimate, but done off, counting various areas. And everyone had to leave the station for 2 weeks because the smell was so bad after the poisoning. So, there's over generations and generations, there has been so much work done. And I think the key to that is actually being here to see it and to do it, and also, having an economic interest in getting it done so you can, continue to have the station perform, but also that we've actually, it's a part of our responsibility, and that we can actually earn the income in order to put it back into looking after these properties. And huge portions of income of high country stations goes straight back into looking after the station. And I think that's something that, perhaps is a misconception that all high country farmers drive around in Range Rovers and holiday in Wanaka, when it's really just not the case. Huge portions of the income of these properties just go straight back into them. They're expensive to look after, they're remote, and so all the services that we try and get in, or any contractors, even just having things delivered here like weed spray, it all costs a lot of money.
Sorry, the reason I laugh is because, all my friends had holiday homes, and I always dreamed of one as a kid. It was just not even on the table. So I totally agree with you. There is a lot of misconceptions there. Emily, can you follow on from the huge work the Murray family have done in pest management?
Yeah, absolutely, Sarah. Welding Pines will probably be number one for us here at Glenmore, purely because historically there was shelter planted around each of the mustering huts up the valley, and now we've just been quietly spreading over the years. But we've been really lucky too. We've had a lot of support from local Welding Pine Trust and also from Environment Canterbury. So we've certainly got that under control, but we have had to take the seed source out. Huge time and energy and resources has gone into taking the seed source out for those. And the other big one for us has been rabbits. Like Kate, historically, the rabbit numbers have spiked just well and truly beyond control. And at the moment, we're dealing with another huge spike in rabbits. And it's actually been a consequence, ironically. We've been working really closely with the Te Manahuna project. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that, but it's a group that wants to make this western side of the Mackenzie Basin predator-free. So we've been working really closely with them, and we've got hundreds of traps around the station. It's been wonderful to take all the ferrets and stoats and rats and cats out of the ecosystem. But the trouble is that's very much reduced the pressure on the rabbits as well. So now we're working with them closely again for the coming winter to really try and get on with those rabbits and get them poisoned.
I'd like to end with a bit of a summary, but also a clear message. Eugenie Sage is chairing the Environment Select Committee, of which many think is a conflict of interest since the Crown Pastoral Land Reform Bill has been her legacy project, if you'd like to call it that. Would each of you feel comfortable in what you would love to say to Eugenie? Kate?
Well, look, I think, and I'm looking forward to being able to see Eugenie when we give our presentation on our submission. But what I would really like to see and say is, look, I think that the outcomes that the bill wants to achieve in having enduring stewardship, having strong support for ecological, environmental values, alongside farming values, is what we all want. We're all really passionate about the high country and, how we look after it. And I think, where we perhaps differ is how that's best done. We would disagree that the regulatory framework is going to achieve those outcomes, to any extent. All I can see it adding is red tape, time and cost, for all parties, not just the farmers. And so I think if we can work collaboratively with farm plans as the tool that we're using, we will be able to achieve those outcomes and more. We should have high aspirations for what we can do in the high country for it to continue to be, an iconic farming area that ends up on advertising all over the world, but also a really, really great base for, strong ecological benefits and Indigenous species to survive and thrive.
Emily?
Again, fully agree with Kate's comments. And further to that collaboration, I think I would really like to see more acknowledgement for the pastoral lessees and for their passion and for how they have cared for 1.2 million hectares of the South Island high country is cared by a very small number of people. So it wouldn't be very difficult, I don't think, for the Crown to work a lot closely with us on an individual level. So I think that acknowledgement would be really key and also this land is in good heart. We've always worked hard, and it is a huge task that we take on because, again, it's that passion and respect for the land that drives us. So if Eugenie could perhaps put more emphasis on that going forward, that would be fantastic.
Following in Jacinda's words of being a bit more kind to understanding the situation around that for our high country leaseholders. Thank you so much to Kate Cox from Mount Nicholas Station, of course, trustee on the High Country Accord, with a submission before the Environment Select Committee on the Crown Pastoral Land Reform Bill, and Emily Murray joining us from Glenmore Station. And over 20 years they have been battling with tenure review to try and get an outcome for their family and generations to come. Thank you so much, ladies. I really enjoyed hearing both of your personal experience, and I know many of our viewers and listeners would have as well, so thank you. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to listen through this week's Opinion Maker show, focusing on the Crown Pastoral Land Reform Bill before government at the moment. I'd love to hear your thoughts and feedback on what you've just heard and your own experience to continue the conversation. My email is sarah@sarahscountry.com, and I absolutely love hearing from our audience. Also, I do have a few spaces left at the table, which I've created calling the Sarah's Country Brains Trust, and I'd really like to invite you, if you want to participate in what is the foundation of 100 members that are super passionate about the primary sector and want to be involved in creation of the content within the show, sharing articles, getting involved in debates, helping me crowdsource this. So if you're interested in that, it's a private Facebook group. It's only 100 people, and it's all particularly on creating the direction of the content within the show. If that sounds like you, get in touch. touch, sarah@sarahscountry.com, and I'll flick you a link to that private Facebook group. I'd really love to have you there. I want a variety of voices, and the people that are members already in there are seriously diverse and wonderful human beings. I'm loving getting the content ideas coming through. Now, coming up on Sarah's Country's Changemaker, which is extremely popular with you all, we have a great lineup of guests. We're going to discuss how New Zealand's horticultural technology is placed internationally with an Etapu Boma Grow speaker, Dr. Ian Yule from Plant Tech Research. There's also 230-gram jars, yes, they're tiny, of New Zealand-made honey that are selling for $5,000 in London. All bought by Harrods. Can you believe that? True Honey Chief Executive Jim McMillan will explain the process of how to add value, and serious value at that. I'm also looking forward to going to the Taranaki, where we will be joined by Donna Cram, who is the chair of the Taranaki Catchment Communities Group, and what they are doing to make a difference in their region. And we'll be joined also to close the show tomorrow on our Changemaker series by a wonderful lady I've had when I very first started Sarah's Country, actually, a recommendation from a viewer that I need to get this lady on the show. The reason to continue on this path is the conversation post-COVID, as that was pre-COVID, on how the US female whole food shoppers' perception of New Zealand may have changed post-COVID. And is our New Zealand food and fibre brands really taking advantage of e-commerce? Green Purse Chief Executive Lisa Mabe Konstaloblis will join us on our Changemaker series tomorrow. In the meantime, wherever you are around the world tuning in, take care of yourself and your loved ones. Ka kite anō.